Hello, good evening and welcome to Staffordshire University. I'm Professor Martin Jones, Deputy Vice-Chancellor and Professor of Human Geography. I would like to welcome you to Staffordshire University this evening for this online event, with a digital and connected opportunity not just to engage our staff, but also the wider research and civic community. We are here today to celebrate research at Staffordshire University through a professorial inaugural lecture from Professor Stella Jones-Devitt with the title The Long March to Critical Pedagogy and Why the Journey Matters. For me, inaugural lectures mark a journey, a rite of passage even within the academic community, from contributing in a single manner to the wider recognition that comes with academic scholarship and leadership. As we'll hear in a moment from Stella, there is a need to invent modes of pedagogy that release the imagination, connect learning to social change, and create social relations in which people assume responsibility for each other. And yet, why do we find this so difficult in higher education? Stella will recount some of her struggles and triumphs along the way in making learning engaging for all, whatever the starting point. Within this lecture, she hopes there'll be something useful for everyone concerning her forays into donkey rides, origami frog making, osmotic walls, zombies and more. Before I hand you over to Stella, a few words about her distinguished academic career. Stella is currently Director of SCOPE, which is the Staffordshire Centre for Learning and Pedagogic Practice, Research Centre at Staffordshire University, where she's also a Professor of Critical Pedagogy and has previously been our University Director of Learning and Teaching. Stella joined Staffordshire University in September 2019 from Sheffield Hallam University. She's a National Teaching Fellow, Principal Fellow of the Higher Education Academy, and has acted as a National Ambassador for Teaching Excellence in Higher Education. Her academic interests, i.e. the things that distract her, include exploring innovative applied evaluation methodologies, flexible pedagogies, and also applying critical thinking to learning and teaching. Stella has contributed recently to the development of the university's Academic Strategy 2030, which incorporates enhanced elements of the original connected curriculum, and I'm very grateful for this. I will now hand you over to Professor Stella Jones-Devitt for her lecture.
Hello everybody. Firstly, thanks to all of you for joining tonight or for watching later. I'm genuinely flattered that you found the time. Those of you who know me will understand that I find it hard to keep my body, especially my hands still, so that I can harmonise with the technology. I'm going to try and keep relatively still, but don't be surprised if I lapse and wander off screen occasionally. Indeed, me doing a lecture is a bit of a strange thing too, as my sessions are normally interactive workshops. However, I promise I will do my best to entertain and challenge in equal measure. You are actually very lucky tonight to be in a virtual audience rather than physical participants. Otherwise, I would love to try out lots of things on you that might cause calculated discomfort. However, I'm delighted and humbled to know that there's quite a diverse audience online. Thank you so much again. So I hope that this session can be relatively informal. If it goes wrong, we'll laugh, and that some of you will find something of interest for investing your time and attention. I'm going to take you through my learning journey relatively chronologically. However, I want to make the point at the outset that everybody's journey depends on who you meet along the way, the social context in which learning relationships are formed, and the available material infrastructure that you have for learning. So let's get going. So being born in Salford during the 1960s in a relatively poor area is supposedly a sign of disadvantage. The word relatively is moot here. Certainly it was disadvantaged if compared with the more affluent suburbs such as Didsbury, Selmore and Chorlton. Yet growing up amongst magnificent monolithic structures such as the gas tower, and that's in the small circular picture in the corner of the screen, and the wonderful cooling towers, which you can see in the first large image on screen, they provide truly beautiful pieces of exciting urban landscape design. These, along with municipal washhouses, often endemic in poorer areas, provided huge opportunities for children like me to play, be fearless and develop creative imaginations, all the things we want to cultivate in our students and actually in our adult selves too. The middle image here pays homage to the magical role played by TV in many working class families at this time. Those of you who've watched The Royal Family, that's Royal with an L-E, i.e. the Mancunians, not the monarchs, will know what a central, almost exotic part the TV played in bringing learning into the homes of those who couldn't afford voluminous quantities of Encyclopaedia Britannica. Indeed, in my own case, I made the most of an inverted, discarded TV screen, as it made the perfect sledge to be whizzed down a steep concrete hill. That was until I came off. This was in Kersal, an area of Salford, not Closters, unfortunately. The final image with the ouch circles that you can see is a recently taken close-up of my elbow, which still bears the 3 pieces of gravel firmly embedded under my skin to this day. However, gravel scared or otherwise, this was a great time to be a child, when everybody shared the same experiences. So happily, I could read from a relatively early age, and I want to make the point here that that's due to lots of input from caring, if financially poor, family members, plus access, as you can see there, to a great state-supported nursery and public library. This was also supplemented by my sister, Teresa, who I'm giving a shout-out to here now, who serendipitously borrowed, if I can use that term, some brand new children's books for me to read, stocked as a sideline at the local chemist shop where she worked. So I gorged secretly on The Black Tulip, Vanity Fair, The Three Musketeers, and The Man in the Iron Mask. Those had to be read with a certain amount of speed and kept pristine so that she could put them back on the shelf as soon as possible, in perfect condition, without any gaps being noticed. And to this day, I must admit, I can't bear seeing books defaced in any way. This sadly borders on an obsession. Importantly for critical pedagogues, however, it also signifies the fundamental impact somebody can have, in this case my sister, when acting upon their values in seeing the educative process as a mechanism for social change. And I want to just pause a slight moment there and say, this isn't always via a grand theoretical narrative or by peer-reviewed publication, but in many times it's by thoughtful, caring action. So at this point, life felt fine for me and my peers until I received my ticket for the Mayor's charity ball for underprivileged children, and that's what that second image relates to. I remember reading the ticket with some disbelief. It was the first time that I'd actually been told I was disadvantaged. It was quite a shock. I remember thinking there must be certain things that I did that perhaps more privileged children didn't do that had led to this label. Possibly the only difference I perceived at this time was that some children appeared to have more money, but it wasn't a big deal. Now, this reminds me of my own practice, and in that I try to avoid rushing to notice difference as disadvantage in learning contexts, and I believe it, as you can see there, to be a fundamental error of thinking. I'm sure I still do this occasionally, but there's nothing like a dose of lived experience to provide what I've called a pedagogic jolt to any complacency. And although I felt quite affronted briefly at the age of 3 or 4 to know that I might be seen as disadvantaged, I managed to get over it very quickly. By the way, before we move on, I do have quite a sore throat shouting at football matches on TV, so do forgive me if I slurp some water occasionally. With the next slide now, you might have noticed on the original imagery that there was roll-down socks. And this has played a central part in advertising this session. It's in that circular image in the top corner of this slide. I've named this experience Insights from Sockgate, for those of you who can remember Watergate, as it formed a pivotal moment in my life and has helped me to develop a curiosity about interrogating why people think what they think. So what happened? At the age of about 11, I was told to, and I'll do the voice, roll down your socks and stand outside my office, in front of about 500 pupils and staff at the start of a school assembly. Apparently, the minuscule red rim round my white socks, which were bought due to being substantially cheaper than the pure white ones, offended the head teacher of my new secondary school. She assumed that I was a rule breaker in need of being punished, so she sent me to stand outside her office for a few hours, further 2 hours. From this defining episode, I grasped a very important point, that context is critical to assumptions made in learning situations. So in this case, false inferences, the notion of willful deviancy, often follow from ill-considered assertions, so again in this case, why I'd broken the rules. If the head teacher had tried to understand the context for my engagement in education at that time, rather than trying to make an example of me, which by the way is never a good idea educationally, she might have arrived at a different, less punitive and more respectful understanding. This incident has had a lifelong and profound impact on me and development of my practice as a facilitator of learning thereafter. I revisited this in a critical thinking book published over a decade ago, in which Liz Smith, the other author, and I considered the nature of assumptions and relationships to the context in learning situations. If we go in a bit closer on the text, if we can, and the diagram on the slide, you will note that many of us in higher education, me included at times, have a vested interest in maintaining the status quo of certain beliefs and values upheld by what I've called the academy, which for those of you who don't know is what we term higher education to be. Therefore, we find it difficult to amend our belief systems, instead making incorrect assumptions, and in this case, the need to preserve arcane rules. Consequently, false inferences inevitably result. Again, the need to punish willful deviancy, which wasn't actually willful at all. Now, I'm telling you about this episode not as a form of catharsis, but as a real moment of enlightenment that spurred me on to try and become, with the emphasis on try here, a higher order thinker. So, in this slide, you can see, called Handy with a Paintbrush, I absolutely love drawing. And amazingly, I won a prestigious Penrose Design Guild Prize for the drawing you can see partially in the circle there. And for those of you who might be able to know who that is, I might provide you with a virtual prize later if you can recognise who that is. But for me, doing art of some form was as natural as putting your shoes on. I didn't know if I was any good at it until teachers started telling me that I had some form of unique talent and that I should consider going to art school. How bourgeois. So I decided to go for it. I had an interview at the then Manchester Poly, which at the time ran the best design and illustration course in the country. I didn't know that. Indeed, I didn't know much about higher education at all, nor did anyone else in my family. But due to my financial circumstances, I could only ever be a home student, so it was Manchester for me or nowhere. I was 10 minutes late for my interview due to my sister's car running out of petrol, so I gladly left her, pushing it off the road while I ran down Oxford Road with my makeshift portfolio. Now, luckily, I was still given an interview and offered a place. And getting into Manchester actually changed my life, yet I had no idea at the time that it would do so. And this chimes with a constant theme that reoccurs when we consider who does and who doesn't go into higher education. I had no insight into the value of going to university other than from the wonderful art teachers at my school, Mrs. Atkins and Miss Beattie, if you're out there, I salute you, who put in so much effort when they might have given up with a surly, difficult, socially unskilled Stella. Not much has changed, that's before my friends get that in there. I didn't appreciate the significance of even getting an interview, let alone being late for it. In essence, I didn't have the social and economic capital to know how to be, and that's a subject I'll return to later. I'm drawn back time and time again to actually the work of Professor David Watson, who did wonderful work, who claimed that we're always failing learners by not helping them to get to what he called the matriculation starting point. For those of you who don't grasp that, it's an unusual term. That's a term that means, either A-levels or O-levels, as I used to call them, GCSEs. So although I dared to counter even this premise later, when working on the short-lived but very illuminative 14 to 19 diploma awards, I suggested to the Department for Education at the time that rather than having parallel award processes, it would be so much better if we had a standard singular set of qualifications, flexible enough to work for all, and actually not underpinned by always advantaging the middle classes, as for example, A-levels do inevitably, and I still hold that view. So I'll just have a slurp of water, and I want you to look at those images, please. On joining the academy, as you can see in the corner there, I expected to be immersed into a heady, vibrant world where truer intellectuals, probably dressed in black polo necks, pursued learning in its purest form. The excessive reverence was probably a leftover from my working class background, and I felt a complete imposter, and that's revisited later in this session. I was in awe of being allowed to join, partly due to my origins, and also because as a woman I still internalised socially constructed notions of male superiority, probably through cultural seepage rather than any kind of overt acceptance. I thought that most of my fellow lecturers, with the emphasis on fellow, would almost be like Galileo pictured here. In reality, my early higher education professional experience was rather difficult to these prior expectations. I was really surprised to find that people weren't that smart. I was shocked, actually. Indeed, I dare to say, with tongue firmly in cheek, that the lovely bespectacled cute pug in the picture here could have matched or even exceeded several of them for intellect. Yet there was clearly a set of prescribed norms and values that dominated, which all were expected to follow unreservedly, especially in a traditional university context. And these related primarily to the social backgrounds of staff, unquestionable sense of entitlement, and the notion of who the ideal student was. And of course, they were made in their own image. And this reminded me of a less democratic version of an ant colony, which you can see there. So I declined to join in this. So despite my misgivings, I actually loved working in a university setting, and I felt privileged to be in roles where you were paid to think and learn. What bliss. However, I also needed to entertain myself along the way. For those of you who haven't come across William Hogarth's work, The Rake's Progress, I urge you to view his artwork online. The rake is pictured in that circular image here. The rake traditionally was a long-established symbol of waywardness and depravity, usually a man, not a garden implement. Hogarth was probably the first great artistic chronicler of modern urban Britain, the experience in Britain, and he produced a series of drawings which illustrated the demise of the rake as an inveterate consumer and man of leisure. In the series, the raker convention fritters his fortune, usually inherited, on sex, drinking and gambling. And this reminded me so much, I hate to say, of some of the indulged men I encountered as work colleagues in my early days of university life. So to amuse myself, I did a series of writings about the rake in higher education, which my colleagues actually loved but never noticed this might have represented them. This also taught me a bit of a lesson, and this is an important one, that if you don't notice your own privilege, mine included, as I even had time to write about it, nothing much changes. I made a change and sought out working in less traditional university settings. However, I got a shock. The political landscape of higher education was changing for all other than the very elite. And the apprentice higher education practitioner at the time needed to grasp the educational requirements were now driven by what I've called quasi-capitalist notions of quality. And you can see that's me there. Anything that wasn't easily packaged, modularised, quantified, visible and sold as an entity and transferable and relevant to the workplace had very little status. And this impromptu picture of me, literally taken as a package, slightly zombified academic, by the way, don't please try that at home, illustrates the prevailing tensions. And these tensions are what Aristotle referred to as the distinctions between praxis, applying your own learning, sometimes to difficult practice, and poiesis, which is making something skillfully. And this is often played out, this schism in contemporary higher education. Now, the middle image perfectly exemplifies how those tensions, how we cultivate learning within those tensions. And I'm absolutely entranced by the work of Michel de Montaigne, who, you can see the book there, is a 16th century thinker. And he wrote free-roaming explorations of life's experiences with charm, wit and honesty that were far ahead of his time and which contribute much today, arguably, to critical pedagogy, as he writes vulnerably, which is what I'm trying to do tonight, about self, to create a mirror in which people recognise their own humanity. Now, cross-reference that with the image behind, which is an equally marvellous book. It's the Knowledge is Beautiful book by the amazing David McCandless, in which he contextualised information beautifully through visual means to enhance our understanding. And this is something that I try to model within my own approach to learning. These revelations have contributed to my pursuit and practice of real, or as I call it, authentic learning, which involves an ongoing dialectical and collaborative process involving reflection, readjustment and enactment, in which theory and practice often become and should become, I would argue, interchangeable, as in the final image here. Indeed, why and where any distinction or dichotomizing needs to be made between thinking and doing, I would argue is questionable. And I think, sadly, we're going to probably move back to that, and I think we should resist it. Now, moving on from that, this slide's a bit busy and I apologise for that, but the thinking critically formed a big part of my learning, and learning from and later reflecting from the earlier formative Sockgate experience has helped me to understand that the most effective forms of critical thinking in higher education are not apolitical acts of skills development. They draw on values of social justice as a basis for practice, and this epitomises what I deem to be important as what I'd call a journeying critical pedagogue. I've applied this understanding in concert with a notion, I hope, of respectful dialogue, in which setting the climate for informal conversations is critical to creating education as a transformative process rather than as a set of transactional activities. In this slide, I've included a few examples of what I've tried to develop in my own practice and share with others too. In that top bit just under the frogs, you will see there, that was my first foray with using creative, what I've called vox pops form of writing, in which I tried to fuse together some of the tensions of learning in a time of marketisation. if we can zoom in, you'll see that I deliberately pay homage to Mills and Boon, believe it or not, rather than Karl Marx, using the notion of pulp fiction writing as a form of access and familiarity. Now, you can draw your own conclusions about its worth, but it did get people writing who actually before then had been scared of academia. The diagram immediately underneath that image defines the essence of a critical thinking process, and again this was developed earlier by Liz Smith and myself. And I want to draw your attention here to the knowledge and evidence element central to critical pedagogy, because we need to recognise that accepted wisdoms change over time in accordance with values and beliefs. Consequently, perceived notions of what counts as effective evidence changes too, and that's an important point when considering how learners navigate learning and higher education generally. So if our learners don't share the dominant values which prevail at the outset of their higher education journey, this makes their navigation and potential success all the harder. And for me, Ulrich Beck got it right when he noticed that not everyone has the resources and confidence to write their own life script successfully. The movable snakes and ladders game pictured, which some of you online have probably had to experience already, alas, that draws on the notion of low-risk gaming to liberate learners and to encourage play. Most of us have a positive memory of childhood games, so I deliberately wanted to use what we call the fancy term here is Vygotsky's notion of proximal development, where we take more risks. Another form of critical thinking used pedagogically also concerns work that we've done with QAA Scotland, and you can see there's a case study to develop students and staff capacity to use and decipher evidence according to context. In the case study, it talks about how things go wrong at what I've called Nudge University, and it offers rationales for why this happens. And this approach provides invaluable reusable learning tools for the critical pedagogue. By the way, I am indebted here, and I want to say this a lot at times tonight, to QAA Scotland and to Liz Austin and to William Hasty for originally driving this work initially and for inviting me to collaborate on what has been some really exciting work. And the final image of the is a chapter there written by Catherine Sammy and myself while I worked at York St John. And in From Accrington Stanley to Academia, first mention of football, by the way, we took the notion of ROM concerning educational forms of caricature and stretched it to breaking point. In this story, the University of Neoliberalia makes its first appearance, amongst many, along with the marvellously tyrannical Carl P. Defoe, its chief executive. And I suggest that this is necessarily absurd writing to allow readers to react to the fanciful stance taken. Again, an important point along the critical pedagog's journey. I also want to give a shout out here to colleagues at York St John University who participated in Catherine and my critical thinking research cluster, and you enabled us to be really bold in our thinking. I am going to tease you about what the origami frogs, and I have some to hand here, are all about at this point. That's in the circular image above. And I hope that some of you might pose me a question about these later if you haven't been scarred by the experience earlier. When I started exploring the role of critical thinking too many years ago, I tended to focus also on my own singular notions of what it was to be a thinker. Experience and hopefully wisdom along with the wrinkles has shifted this perspective. And there are 2 points to make here, 2 really important points. Firstly, I absolutely now believe that the best teachers act as resources for shared experiences of learning rather than as expert performers. Hence, whilst leaving the ego behind can feel difficult, it can also be incredibly liberating. Secondly, I feel it's impossible to be an effective critical thinker if doing so singularly. Thinking and practice are always improved by access to the ideas of others, even if you don't actually believe in what others say. So in this slide, the imposter imposes, I'm not going to dwell too much on it, as it already feels just like too much self-aggrandisement on a cold Monday night in January. However, what a shock, me as a National Teaching Fellow, amongst what I've called the glitterati of learning and teaching. Now, this was an incredibly uncomfortable process in which, even up to the revelatory online midnight moment, as you can see there in that image, I actually perceived that I would find out a mistake had been made and I wouldn't be listed. And this discomfort of exposure and visible risk of failure is something that we have to remember when we ask this of our learners and we experience it in our own learning. However, I must admit that to be judged worthy of inclusion from a group already recognised as excellent felt like quite an achievement. They are also, I have to say this to all the NTFs out there, a wonderfully supportive resource. It's the equivalent on a winter's day of a pedagogic electric blanket. Yet I also learned too that there are many colleagues, learners and people in all areas of life, some of whom are hopefully online tonight, quietly being excellent within their own context without gaining overt reward. And I now understand actually that it's really important not to take yourself too seriously. And as I've often said, we're really just mere specks of carbon, or hopefully a bit more than that, maybe stardust individually. But when we become so much more when we combine these elements together. However, I do want to thank Sally Bradley here for being the velociraptor, yes, Sally, that got me to apply for an NTF and who selflessly cajoled and bootcamped me into shape and belief. Now, in my NTF application, I mentioned the need for my practice being akin to that of a tightrope walker. And if you're not aware of that, that is known properly by the wonderful term funambulist. Comes from funaire, I think, to which is rope and ambulare, to walk. And in the words included here, they describe why, if we can zoom in briefly. I'm indebted to former colleague Sue Bauer, who gave me a book about somebody's struggles with tightrope walking, and she said that it reminded her of me. And in case you are wondering, I really can't do traditional funambulism or tightrope walking, but I hope I can do so educationally. And the image you can see there is actually one of me struggling with the tightrope, and the ambiguity underneath is because you actually don't know whether those things are pyramids, you don't know whether they're sharks, you don't know how high up that rope is, and I will probably come back to that at a point soon. Okay, this is a really important area of this presentation, so forgive me for dwelling on this a little bit. And this is what I've called the burden of the non-traditional. And it's always bothered me by why those bringing certain forms of prior experiences that enrich learning in higher education are often problematised as some kind of lumpen mass of what are labelled as non-traditional. Now, invariably, the non-traditional, as they're called, have to try harder to access the same opportunities, whether that's through lacking acceptable types of social network or in not having what I've called requisite cultural capital. And yet I noticed, and I've noticed during my academic career, a compelling yet curious paradox. It appeared to take some people much more emotional and physical labour, often achieved by having to battle through adversity, to arrive at the same starting point in order to gain access to study, and much of which is put in place by rigid higher education infrastructures. So some colleagues and I animated this through creating what we called a physical osmotic wall process. And again, if you were here physically tonight, I would probably impose this on you, in which certain operating conditions of higher education allow certain gaps to open or close for specific groups of learners to pass through or not. And this provided a graphic and physical experience of what it felt like to be closed out. I did this in a conference at Sheffield Hallam with a group of people, and I remember certain people in the audience actually still feeling quite traumatised by trying to get through this wall that suddenly closed in on them. However, to move on from that, in health-related curriculum areas, this paradox also, because that was my area of study, included the involvement of young people, for example, wishing to undertake entry-level professional preparation, and those who were already placed in support roles, who were forced to learn yet were often offered little scope for career development. Now, I've illustrated this through time and time again through what I've called a tale of two donkey rides. And if I'll share this story with you, if you'll forgive my indulgence. And in this story, one rider gets to the seaside comfortably by car, has prior experience, knows the donkey ride owner, thus gets extra rides and has the pick of the best donkeys. Now, this compares with another would-be rider who gets the bus to the seaside, which is always late, looks after dependents along the way, has only been able to read about donkeys but knows loads about them, ends up at the back of the queue, has one ride on the most flea-bitten of donkeys. But despite this, both enjoyed the experience, but one had to put a disproportionate level of effort in to be at the same starting point. And I want to give thanks here to Hilary Wiles, Catherine Arnold and Sharon Enser, who worked with me on the 14 to 19 diplomas, where we actively challenged this disparity. And they shared enormous insight that helped me to understand why the contrasting donkey ride stories were totally unacceptable. And this is exemplified here by the two diagrams in the slide. If we could take another look at them, because this came from research I undertook concerning barriers of learning of young people doing BTECs rather than A-levels and the obstacles to learning they experienced. And essentially, I did this graphic. We basically, if you can look at the top there, we metaphorically chopped the heads off many of our young non-traditional learners a long time before university because they don't know how to be, as I didn't. I gave this A Tale of Two Learners exercise to colleagues at a CEDA conference, and although you can only see 2 examples there are actually 6 of those, and each one has one of those views on. So the first one there you can see says sit back, relax, do nothing, and the other you go right through to invent a language you don't understand. The final one, which I've not got on there, is actually in Russian, and I gave that to people, and of course, luckily, most of them couldn't do it. So I gave this to people at a CEDA conference, and I got people for 10 minutes to examine facets of disadvantage, just given out randomly from the findings. And I must tell you that my suggested fusion of BTEC and A-levels into one more inclusive award, done in order to reduce disadvantage, went down like what I would call the proverbial lead balloon with some elite university colleagues, who contended that I really shouldn't be using higher education for social engineering. If I can just pause, and I'll leave that thought with you, yes, so we shouldn't be socially engineering in higher education. The Beyond You Said We Did, I co-designed with a wonderful colleague, Anne-Marie Steele, who, when we both worked at Sheffield Hallam University, and we wanted to develop a shared approach with in-work students whose voices are often unheard or indeed misheard by policymakers and practitioners. Now, the trigger for this interest occurred when I heard somebody who'd just been awarded with a really prestigious National Student Engagement Prize say that thinking about effective engagement of part-time or in-work students, to quote, was on the too difficult to-do list. And everybody nodded and just moved on. And I couldn't quite cope with that. So with some teaching development grant funding from the then HEA, and thank you HEA and Advanced HE colleagues, thank you, we explored alternative approaches for effective engagement of part-time and in-work students. And this comprised 2 significant outputs, and that was decided upon by the students. What you can see there on screen is an animation of key messages, and it was entitled, "Do You Know Who We Are? We Think You Should," by in-work students. And that was for students and policymakers alike. And this was created alongside a manifesto for in-work student engagement, again, designed as a conduit for change. The animation was directed and voiced by the real students, who look as they do on the drawings. We don't have time to play it now, but I would urge you to watch the animation, and there are links. The students were fabulously challenging. At a time, I was arrogantly thinking I understood disadvantage. And they held us to account like never before, I've never experienced before. Producing the manifesto for in-work students, they insisted on doing this, which helped to shape policy and thinking nationally and internationally. Anne-Marie and I shared that with colleagues in Slovenia who were going to take some of it forward. And for example, insights about the use and rejection of the virtual learning environment, which is one of the points they make at the bottom there, due to interface overload. We thought that was because they couldn't grasp the technology, but actually that was wrong. They were already using lots and lots of interfaces in their job, and we had wrongly assumed a skills deficit. So we'd actually just assumed they couldn't do the work, and actually what they had done was they just said, we don't want to use this. We really don't. So again, just to make the point there that we had assumed something that we didn't actually know, and gone to a skills deficit approach, which seems to be the default position. Okay. So moving on to the next slide here, this getting animated came from evidence emerging from that project. And it was quite surprising that genuinely, and maybe none of you are surprised by this, but that institutions do not always know the motivations and the needs of the so-called harder to reach students, and we might come back to that term. This aligned with my own student experience. Consequently, a varied group of us at Sheffield Hallam who were interested in flexible pedagogies designed a project to scope a range of diverse voices, and that was in order to understand what flexible learning might mean, but for systems and pedagogy throughout the student life cycle. We felt this provided a bit of a step change, as most of the work in the sector concerning flexibility thus far had been about teaching delivery, not about ideas and values. And this work, as you can see there, comprised an animated tool called Getting Animated About Flexible Learning and a supportive case study which described innovative snowball sampling approaches to actually reach people and scenario modelling techniques for change. Out of this came a flexible learning community of practice supported by the former HEA, thanks again. And I'm indebted here, and I know he's online, I hope, to Sam Elkington, then of the HEA and now at Teesside University, who supported this development, and he put up with what he has described as one of the most funniest moments ever, when I was trying to communicate with him silently, a bit like this and stealthily while doing a flexible learning webinar. And apparently I resembled something akin to what a tasered cat might look like, because I was waving my arms and everything about in front of him, trying to attract his attention in silence. So you can imagine how difficult it is for me at the moment to actually keep my hands still, but I am doing well. So learning from this work enabled me to be invited to author several iterations of the Advanced HE Flexible Learning Framework for enhancing student success. And that's in the top corner there in the circle. And I must also give thanks to Catherine Arnold and Mike Snowden. Catherine was a colleague at Sheffield Hallam and Mike at Huddersfield, who were also co-authors on the first version. And most importantly, I believe that the recent flexible pedagogies work and analysis, which I think has been very exciting in difficult times, puts critical pedagogy centre stage. And for me, the definition, if you'll forgive me, by Catherine, Mike and myself still holds true. And I'll quote that we said, "Flexible learning concerns institutions constructing and continually evaluating infrastructure, policies and practices that offer the widest possible opportunity for successful student engagement and belonging of all stakeholders in higher education." And I can't stress that enough. And again, I want to give thanks here to Stuart Norton at Advance HE for co-presenting a webinar. The details are on there. And in supporting related writings about notions of what we call structured flexibility in the present context. The links are on the Advance HE website and on here. And by structure, what I mean by that is that you should consider that it's not solely about delivery. We should be thinking about spaces for learning, and I know lots of people are doing great work in that area. We should be working on promoting structured learning, not transmission. That our students really need to be key stakeholders from the outset, although that's scary. Designing a completely integrated experience is absolutely essential to beat exclusion caused by digital poverty, and that's come more and more to the fore in the circumstances we find ourselves in. But also that subjects and disciplines will be able to interpret and plan flexible learning approaches within context. Now, evaluating what works and most importantly why will also help future planning for success. And I'm going to talk more about evaluation shortly, which some of you will not be surprised about. Okay, now, here's an interesting thing for you to look at. And thank you to the Stoke Sentinel for giving it a plug. This is about zombies. So, a few interested academics, including me, began to playfully consider current debates about the emergence or resurgence, dependent on your present level of optimism, of zombie leadership within higher education. And this all started by me personally being really fed up with some latest policy shift, which I didn't think acted in the learner's best interests. So I wrote about it for Wonky, which you can see there, which is the University of the Living Dead. I then put feelers out for alternative perspectives through my known academic networks. Thought I'd be talking to myself and was amazed by the level of interest. It was obvious that something had resonated with many practitioners, culminating in what I would call, tongue-in-cheek, a Spielberg-like zombie performance pedagogy that analysed conditions which, left unchallenged, could escalate into swarms of full-blown zombie leaders, chaotically reinforcing development of zombie organisations. I'm presuming some of this might sound a bit familiar. I do want to just mention as well there that the Times Higher also loved that, and we did quite a bit more work around that. But I do want to say for this frivolity, which had a purpose, I want to give thanks here again to Catherine Arnold and Liz Austin, to Sam Elkington, to Joe Verron and Tony Wall. And we also became known as the Zombie Excellence Network. And I learned so much from these guys because and had a great deal of fun at the same time. And I'll draw on specifically what they wouldn't let me do. They wouldn't let me unpack meaning for participants from the performance pedagogy we ran at the Advanced HE conference, and it worked really well, I have to say. But as a cognitive individual, I wanted to explain what we'd done and why, but I was outvoted and they were having none of it. The discomfort in the session was palpable for me, but essential. And I learned even now that it's still very healthy to experience discomfort in your own learning, and that's regardless of how long you've been in higher education. We actually built the wonderful Dr. Jolliest Vendettas, who you can still find on Twitter, by the way. You can see her also sitting lifelessly in the conference audience there, in the further image above the zombies label. She's even written a piece for the Times Higher, referenced on the slide here, and also designed the marvellous Zombie Excellence Framework with related criteria. And any Office for Students colleagues who are on there, this might be of interest, especially now. Now, sadly, even before the COVID-19 pandemic, which obviously we can't get away with not mentioning, we contended that the optimum conditions for what we call pedagogic infection were prevalent, and these are based on the idea of high levels of agreement, sameness and certainty, and we felt that they were manifest in contemporary higher education and would actually lead to a distinctly unhealthy sector. And there has perhaps never been a better time than now to embrace experimentation, fun and measured risk-taking in what we do to survive in this context, and that this will hopefully keep us all alive as sentient beings. I do need to say as well there that I think that if you think about sameness, it really is quite damaging. And one of the things as a critical pedagogue is that it's absolutely critical that we do notice when we're just talking to the same people at the same time about the same things. And that was essentially what happened with our zombie thinking. So over to the evaluative mindset now. And one of the most exciting collaborations I've been involved in relatively recently concerns work to help develop what I and others have called the evaluative mindset. You might not find that very exciting, but some of us do. And this helps to measure an evidence change. And as you can see there, we've zoomed in on the arrow diagram here, and that's known as a logic chain. It's now often grandly also known as a theory of change model. Now, usually in higher education, if you look at that slide carefully, the first three stages shown are often dealt with, so concerning what is the issue, what resources or inputs do we need, and what outputs might occur. Now, outputs and tangible, or I would argue intangible gains, are often forgotten, as is meaningful impact. Now, from a critical pedagogic perspective, these are probably the most important facets, along with revisiting the issues to see if changes made have been positive. And I do want to give a big shout out here to colleagues in the Student Engagement, Evaluation and Research team, luckily known hereafter as STEER, at Sheffield Hallam, for supporting this work and for enabling innovative use of integrative review. Integrative review is an interesting methodology in which existing evidence is gathered, then analysed in specific context in which it's being applied. In the Class of 2020 example here, we deliberately invited the diversest range of students, so we engineered that to engage in active sense-making and prioritising of global evidence about belonging, curriculum, assessment, etc., but within their own context. So to just pause there, what we did was we took all the global evidence and then we got them to rank and prioritise what that meant to them in their own context at Staffordshire or at Sheffield. And it wasn't done for feedback purposes. It actually formed part of the evidence base upon which effective experience in context continues to be built. At Staffordshire University, we've now taken forward using integrative review methodology. If you don't know it, look it up, it's great, and I will send anybody who wants it some links. It's a really exciting way to drive engagement and evidencing of our academic strategy for 2030. Martin Jones mentioned that earlier, and I wish to thank both Martin Jones and Simone Clark, who's now at Harper Adams, amongst others, for having the imagination, creativity and passion to put this into place as part of a determined effort to enhance the success of our future learners. And hopefully this process contributes to, and I'm quoting here from Scarce and Fulton, and they said, what would it mean if asking what if in a disciplined way allowed you to rehearse the possibilities of tomorrow and to take action today, empowered by those provocations and insights? And I'm indebted to them for that powerful missive. And within the uncertain context of COVID-19, seeking to understand what works in higher education has taken on the most crucial significance. So evaluating interventions effectively in order to provide the fullest opportunities for all students to be successful learners regardless of their contrasting starting points, is needed more than ever as the sector and higher education practitioners navigate an array of ambiguities, intangibles and anxieties. And a plea from me here, can we really try and leave deficit explanations? Can we put it at the bottom of the list? And again, I want to thank here Liz Austin, Alan Donnelly and Nathaniel Pickering, amongst many colleagues at STEER at Sheffield Hallam, with whom I've worked closely and gained so much understanding of the hidden curriculum in some research we took relatively recently. And thanks also go to Tim Hinchcliffe at Advance HE for publishing our work, including a manifesto, I like my manifesto, for practitioners on the hidden curriculum. And just to pause there, one of the things that I'm trying to do in this session is to actually almost bring my hidden curriculum to life. So when I'm talking about personal things, it's to show my learning and think about whether that mirrors your experiences. And in that way, I'm trying to make myself vulnerable. And it's really important that we do that with our students, that actually students want to know why we study something. Why did we end up in higher education? Why are we passionate about our subject? Why do we do what we do? Why are we so keen for them to succeed? And sometimes I don't think we share our own views enough in that way. So, in conclusion, much of my work in higher education has involved considering ways of getting reluctant, also known as the awful term hard to reach learners, to engage in processes deemed previously too difficult. And we can do this by providing an underpinning safety net of collaborative engagement in which all learners can take calculated and well-supported risk with their learning. And as an aside, wouldn't it be great if we could all acknowledge, or at least notice, that it's often universities that are hard to reach, not learners per se. But perhaps maybe that's for another day, or even a question later. When going back to my formative Sockgate episode, I noticed that I had a small but very strong set of important others, of family, friends and 2 specific teachers who encouraged my development, and that was regardless of difficult social circumstances. And therefore, despite structural and social barriers, I appeared to succeed despite these experiences. And whilst many learners are still unheard, and often unknowingly, I hope, ignored in the sector, I am comforted by the fact that meaningful learning is often difficult for everybody. Witness my recent zombie discomfort. And yet, it would be great if we could make it easier by our actions in higher education for everybody to succeed unheroically. It would be so good if we don't have to just focus on the heroic people who've bucked the trend. Now, those of you who know me will be absolutely expecting a football-related aspect, and I'm not going to disappoint you. I am going to disappoint in the sense of, from a copyright perspective, if I was allowed, I would be now playing a piece of football folklore known as the Aguero moment. And this is well known, as I say, in Mancunian footballing folklore, and it gives us all hope. In 2012, after 44 repeatedly unsuccessful years, Manchester City Football Club finally won the league title. Now, they did so by having elements needed for many to succeed in higher education. The first thing, which you can see in that image there, is great teamwork, which is why I included the cogs above there in the image. As if one fails in that picture, we all fail, nothing works. The second thing is humility, and to see how small we all are in the picture in the galaxy. And the third thing is, looking at that image, we have to have considerable diversity, allied with fearless risk-taking. And if you consider the last image, who would even go and get coffees at the moment, let alone order them with so much variation? In the circle above, there are ordinary people on the pitch at the Etihad, which for those of you who don't know is Manchester City's ground, and it's taken from 2012. And these people aren't superstars. They're people who have immense belonging, loyalty and affinity to a football club that's had a roller coaster history. Arguably it's got money now, before my friends get that in there, and will probably continue to have a roller coaster history. Yet all the people on that pitch, and myself included, love the club and endure the agonies. And I think that's a great testament to the characteristics needed for this long march to critical pedagogy. And finally, what I hope all this demonstrates is that without developing meaningful and collaborative relationships, very little can be achieved on our own journey, and certainly on my journey. And I've tried to model this within the lecture tonight, hopefully giving credit to the people who've helped me along the way, which I couldn't have done without their help. And as learners, we are all, as I've called, half a person, and that draws on the great song by the Mancunian band The Smiths. You'll just have to imagine it playing in the background. As to become whole and make meaningful change, we really do need to value and learn from the diverse experiences of others, otherwise we'll never succeed. And I'd like to thank you there for listening. Hopefully that's been informative. And I'd also like to particularly thank my long-suffering husband Dave and my daughter Grace, who have put up with my eccentricities and getting them to do bonkers thing whilst I've been working in academia. And I'm very happy if people have got questions to also take them. So thank you so much for listening and for your time.
Thank you, Stella. That was an excellent lecture. As Stella said, we are online for the next few minutes. So if you do have any questions, just pop them in the chat. However, if you are watching this on demand, please do pop any questions that you've got, and we will send them to Stella for her to answer at another date. You can also have a look at all our other events that we are delivering virtually at the moment at staffs.ac.uk/events. We have got a question. Thank you. What activities work for a staff critical pedagogy support group?
I think building capacity is absolutely critical to that. Being able to take risks with your practice, not thinking that there is some kind of punitive output from that, and I think that's endemic across the whole of the sector. So the idea to play, I think, is really critical, and to laugh. I mean, you know, we talked about this before this session. If this went pear-shaped, I think the best thing to do is just to laugh and actually not take yourself too seriously. And I think once you get over that barrier, you can actually work with colleagues to break new ground. But I also think you learn so much from having people who are just not like you necessarily. I have been challenged, and there are several people online I know, who have challenged me enormously to justify sets of beliefs, assumptions, and really caused me to change my thinking quite rightly, and sometimes to defend my thinking. And I think we need to create that climate where people are prepared to take other people's views on board, but actually still prepared to argue their case without that being internalised as personal criticism. And to have the space and time to play, I think, is crucial. If we're all just doing the do, then we never stop and we never get off that treadmill. And sometimes that's what that zombie work's about, that we all feel like we're kind of lurching about aimlessly and endlessly, all doing our best for our students, but actually sometimes we don't know whether that's the best for our students, and we don't maybe always engage our students in knowing what's best for them.
Thank you. That's all the questions that have been typed in. Lots of comments for you, Stella, to go and read back on from friends and colleagues. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody.